Well, it's been great to worship the Lord there, and let's keep that middle verse in our minds as we come to our matter of prayer, where it said, "Hope will rise as we wait upon the Lord," because although we come to consider things that we might be discouraged by, if we just look at the situation in the world, we can have hope that the Lord may have mercy. And He's more likely to have mercy if we cry to Him, and therefore there is hope as we cry to Him this afternoon. I want to speak this afternoon on the topic of euthanasia and assisted suicide, because there's some significant developments at this time which we really need to pray about. I'm going to be mainly giving information, developments that are happening or that have happened, although we will look at some scriptures or consider some scriptures at the end. There is going to be a number of stats of the information given out, and so I appreciate it might be hard to take everything in, but the talk will be going on YouTube during the next week, so if you want to revisit it you can do, or if you want to furiously scribble notes, that's also up to you. But just to say as I start, I've used both terms there, assisted suicide and euthanasia, and if you're not aware already, they are closely linked but not quite the same, because euthanasia is when the doctor or whoever gives the fatal dose of whatever a person might have. Assisted suicide is when the person themselves take the medicine. But that's the only difference. Basically, in both cases, it's somebody choosing to end their life legally, as opposed to normal suicide when it comes as a shock and there was no legal process. That's what I want to speak about this afternoon, and then we're going to go straight into a time of prayer about it. The most up-and-coming developments to happen actually will be happening this Tuesday. So in 3 days' time, there is going to be a vote with the British Medical Association. Let's say the Doctors' Union, shall we say. And they're going to be voting on whether to drop their official stance opposing assisted suicide or euthanasia. I'm going to use those terms interchangeably, so when I say one, I'm talking about the other as well. So they have traditionally opposed it, said that they don't believe it's right, which of course fits with the Hippocratic Oath for doctors to do no harm. The Royal College of Nursing dropped their opposition in 2009, and they took up a neutral stance. And so it may well happen on Tuesday that the Doctors' Association may also become neutral, so that they're saying we are not against it, we are not for it, we are neutral on it. There was a poll recently of members of the association, so not the official vote, but there was a poll, and it found that 40% want there to be a change. So 40% want the British Medical Association to support euthanasia, not just to be neutral, but to support it. Or that's their personal belief. So 40% of those who were surveyed in the British Medical Association support assisted suicide. 21% want them to take a neutral stance. 33% want them to keep up the opposition, and only 6% were undecided. So there's quite strong opinions either way amongst the doctors. But I'll just say those stats again, because they're probably one of the most important ones to say today. 40% want to support euthanasia, 21% want it to be neutral, 33% still want to oppose. Interestingly, the doctors who actually deal with the elderly and the terminally ill were the most likely to oppose euthanasia, because they've been at the coalface, shall we say. They've seen what it's like. You might think, oh, well, they'd approve of assisted suicide because they've seen their suffering, as the argument goes. But actually, they're the ones most to oppose euthanasia being brought in. Whereas retired doctors and student doctors who never yet actually practiced properly are the most likely to support. And no doubt the younger generation of doctors are more likely, as being younger, to support euthanasia anyway. And the concern is that if on Tuesday the association votes to take up a neutral position, this will be used by campaigners to say, right, let's change the law. They're not asking for them to support it, they just want them to go neutral so they can use this. And in Canada, which I'm going to refer to again soon, the Canadian Medical Association went neutral in 2013, and this was seen as a key step because 2 years later in 2015, Canada legalised euthanasia. So the doctors there going neutral was a pivotal moment, and it could be pivotal in our nation. If this situation on its own was on its own, we might think, okay, well, it's a little bit important. But actually, in both Westminster and the Scottish Parliament, there are bills, private members' bills, i.e. not from the government, that are about to be considered on this matter. The last time this matter was considered and voted on in both the Scottish and National Parliament was in 2015, so 6 years ago. It was resoundingly defeated. 330 voted against it in Westminster compared to 118 who voted for it. It was also resoundingly defeated in the Scottish Parliament in 2015. 36 were for it, 82 were against it. And I find it interesting that there was a bill in both places then, and there is a bill in both places now. Humanists UK are one of the various organisations that are pushing this. And actually, after preparing this, I was sent some information showing a whole group of different organisations have signed a joint letter calling for euthanasia to be legalised. So Humanists UK are just one of many voices. But one of their directors said this recently. The UK's laws on assisted dying are in urgent need of review. It is highly significant that in the years since our lawmakers last considered proposals on assisted dying, progressive countries around the world have continued to roll back their bans in the face of overwhelming evidence. So they're basically saying, look, so much has changed since 2015, and it has done. Several countries in the world have legalised this. I actually had different figures for it. Some said 6, some said 9. I guess it depends on the technicalities. But at least 6 countries have voted to allow this already. And they're saying others are considering it, and so we should be as well. In Westminster, the private members' bill is in the Lords. Baroness Nietzsche has introduced this, and she has claimed that there should be enough support in the Lords for her bill to pass this time. Because he's saying there's been a big change in opinion since 2015. Thankfully, another Baroness Finlay, is helping Care Not Killing to gather support for a letter from healthcare professionals against euthanasia. It sounds like they're getting a lot of signatures, which is good. So there's a goodie and a baddie, shall we say, in the Lords who are pushing these things at the moment. In the Scottish Parliament, it's a Lib Dem MSP, not that the party matters at all, but there's a Lib Dem MSP called Liam MacArthur. But unfortunately, it's not just him or his party here. A cross-party group of 12 MSPs have signed an open letter supporting his bill. 12 MSPs is just under 10% of the Scottish Parliament. So 10% of MSPs have signed this letter supporting it, and obviously others will support it who haven't said. Baroness Nietzsche's bill in the Lords is going to be debated next month in October, and Liam MacArthur's bill in Scotland, there's meant to be a consultation to do with it in the autumn at some point. So we've got 3 key things happening. We've got the British Medical Association, their vote is this Tuesday. We've got Baroness Nietzsche's bill in the Lords in October, and at some point in the autumn, the first development of the Scottish bill. That is why we're considering this matter today. Now, I mentioned Canada earlier, and I think they're a helpful example to consider. As I said earlier, they legalised euthanasia in 2015. 6 years later, 2% of the deaths there are from assisted suicide. 2%. So 2 out of every 100 deaths there are because people have chosen to end their lives. The majority of those will be things like cancer, for example, a terminal diagnosis. But clearly, this is not just the odd few here and there. Even 2% is quite concerning, and obviously it's only likely to increase. The bill in Canada was originally only meant for those with a foreseeable death. I think something like people likely to die within 6 months, something along those lines. But 4 years later, I read that a fifth of victims were giving loneliness as a reason. And it wasn't clear whether that was the only reason. I somehow doubt it because, I doubt that is the only reason, but it was clearly part of the reason. They're saying that they're lonely, maybe they've not got living relatives, whatever it might be, but it shows that this can be for all kinds of reasons. It was legalised in 2015, but in 2019, 4 years later, a Canadian court struck down the requirement for there to be a terminal illness. So the Canadian Parliament put this safeguard in, and a court got rid of the safeguard from a kind of court's point of view. And because of that, in March this year, the Canadian government expanded the law. Maybe they would have done anyway, but they were forced to. And so they expanded the law. They said, okay, it doesn't just have to be for a terminal illness. They removed some of its safeguards to do with how long somebody had to go between saying they wanted it and it happening. And they're even going to say they allow assisted suicide for serious mental illness. Obviously, what you define as a serious mental illness is a question, and somebody could pretend to have a serious mental illness. So, where I said that 2% of Canada's deaths are from this, it's only going to increase, as it's recently been expanded. It shows with the court and then the government making these changes, we can't trust Westminster or Edinburgh as governments to keep safeguards on this if they bring it in, and we can't trust the courts to uphold those safeguards, because they may not. Incidentally, we're not praying about it particularly, unless the Lord was ready to change the direction, but Canada's election is the 20th of this month, and surprisingly, the current governments are in danger, so maybe something to remember in prayer as well. Now, the chief executive of Care Not Killing, which is a group trying to oppose these moves, made a few points recently in the face of the opinions that we should be legalising it. One of the things they said was that wherever assisted suicide is legalised, there is widespread discrimination against elderly people and the disabled. Well, there would be, wouldn't there? If you live in a society that says, you should, that you can be killed legally, you can choose to end your life legally because of being old or because of being disabled, that sends a message about the value or lack of value of such lives. That similar point has been made about abortion over disabilities. That's why Heidi Crowder challenged in the courts to abortion being legal up to birth for those with things like Down syndrome. That's why that is being pursued, because they're saying, well, it sends a message, if I've got Down syndrome, my life isn't as valuable. And it can do a similar thing with euthanasia. In the state of Oregon, in America, because different states have different rules, almost 60% of those who died through assisted suicide said that they feared being a burden on their families. 60% cited that as at least part of the motivation. Well, we know all the things that have been going on with COVID, and it's been quite a focus, hasn't there, on the elderly and people in care homes. You can imagine what many of them might feel like if this is legalised. The other point that this chief executive made is that there's a growing body of research showing that legalising assisted suicide can lead to an increase in the suicide rate in the general population. So wherever euthanasia is legal, it may well lead to there being more suicides in the community, should we say. Because again, it sends a message that it's okay to end your life. It sends a message that life can be, cheaply stopped. So why should somebody feel like they should go through all the hoops? They're thinking, well, it's legal anyway, I'll just do it myself. Already we have a concerning level of suicide, and yet this is only likely to push it further. And that was not just this chief executive's point. Others have made this point as well to do with suicide. In the Netherlands, now the Netherlands are even further down this road than Canada. They've had it legalised for longer. I've got the year 2002 in my head, I think it might have been then. And now, 4.5% of all deaths are due to people choosing to end their lives this way. At least 10 people who've ended their lives there have been teenagers. Could have been as young as 12. We just don't know the exact ages. And an article in a scholarly journal, the Journal of Ethics and Mental Health, in 2017 said, "It is often argued that the option of euthanasia will keep patients from attempting suicide. The opposite seems to be the case. The suicide rates in the Netherlands are the fastest growing when compared to surrounding European countries, most of which lack the option of euthanasia." That was in 2017. Spain certainly has legalised it this year since then, and there might be one or two others in Europe. But at that point they were saying the suicide rate is growing at its greatest in the Netherlands where it's legal. So there's clearly a link. Now I mentioned abortion just in passing before, but I can certainly see a link here with the way that abortion was legalised back in 1967. Because then it was only meant for limited circumstances. And people have said before that they had no idea. And maybe if you were alive then and were considering this issue, maybe you had no idea that 9 million or whatever figure that we're up to now, babies would have been aborted since that legalisation. For all kinds of reasons, not just the narrow ones like the danger to life that were first envisaged. Truly it was a slippery slope for abortion, and surely it's likely to be the same if it's legalised for assisted suicide here in our nation. I don't know how much believers realised what was going to happen then, but we would have no excuse for not realising now what would happen, because we've seen it, haven't we? We've seen what's happened with abortion, we've seen the example, and we really need to take heed. It's made me sit up and take notice of this when I thought about that. And it's particularly poignant because in the past year, the news has come out that abortion is at its highest level in England and Wales, and also in Scotland. It's at its highest level on record. Public opinion is the other thing to consider in this matter. Obviously, we hope that public opinion will be on the right side, and that if it's on the wrong side, that it won't lead to governments making the wrong choices. But we do need to bear in mind, it's interesting that interesting is the wrong word, but in Jersey, the island of Jersey, a citizens' jury came together to consider whether or not to legalise assisted suicide. That citizens' jury resulted in a verdict that there was 78% support for legalising it. That's from the interim report which has come out. The full report from them is going to be turned into a proposition for Jersey's Parliament to consider. You might think, oh, that's just Jersey. But the SNP in Scotland promised before their election in May that if they were re-elected, they would hold annual citizens' assemblies, and said one topic that would be discussed with those would be assisted suicide. So sooner or later we are going to see a group of citizens come together to discuss this issue. And as one journalist said, and I'll quote them, "The value of these citizens' juries, as shown in Ireland over abortion, is that if they support reform, they allow politicians the cover of the public will." Sometimes politicians ignore the public and do what they want anyway. But if they are nervous about something, if the public is behind them or seem to be behind them, then they can feel that they can say, well look, so the SNP can say, look, the Citizens' Assembly in Scotland has come up with this proposition. Who are we to oppose them? In case you're wondering, well, would they back that as the public? One poll found that 72% of Scottish voters back assisted suicide being legal. 72%. 14% are unsure, 14% are against it. So a significant majority of Scottish voters, according to this poll, said that they support it being legalised. In 2017, a while ago, the British Social Attitude Survey asked a question about this and said that 78%, again in the 70s, 78% supported the idea of this, of somebody's life being ended at their request. And a recent poll found that 93% of people in the UK either approved of or wouldn't rule out suicide for somebody who is terminally ill. So, from all these polls, we can see actually there probably is a majority now for this. And that's certainly news. And so as we head towards prayer, just to share just a few points from biblical things. For time's sake, I'm not going to go over the obvious scriptural principles about why we're against it. I trust we're all on board with why we believe it's wrong. Obviously, we're made in the image of God. All life is precious. God is sovereign. He holds our life in his hands. And he says that murder is wrong, more than just wrong. It's an abomination in his sight. And God has said that it brings blood guiltiness on our land if it's not punished. That's what he said for Israel. Surely true for our nation with all of the babies that have been aborted. But surely our blood guiltiness will grow if at the other end of life lives are ended like this. John 10 verse 10 says, "The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly." The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. That's what our enemy wants, isn't it? He desires everybody to be destroyed. He tries to do it at the beginning of life with abortion. He tries to do it during life by wrecking people's lives. He tries to end lives early with suicide in the community. And what is often at the end of a person's natural life, he tries to do it through euthanasia and assisted suicide. And the enemy, no doubt, as with other countries, wants to end more lives in our nation. Whereas God desires all men to be saved. We know from the Bible that he is long-suffering, he is patient towards people, he gives them chances to turn. That's what the word says. But suicide ends those lives early. It cuts down the chances that they might have had to turn to the Lord. And who knows, for all these people with a terminal diagnosis who have ended their lives early, who knows whether maybe a bit longer they'd had it and they might have turned to the Lord. So besides the fact that it's a sin in the Lord's sight to end lives, there's also the point that it cuts down their opportunities to turn to him. I find it very interesting thinking about a verse in Lamentations 5 and verse 12. Obviously Lamentations is mourning the way that God brought judgment on the land in various ways. I don't want to make too much of this. I hope I'm not twisting this verse at all. But Lamentations 5 and verse 12 says, "Princes were hung by their hands. Elders were not respected." It's talking about the way that the foreign power that came in there, that the Lord had called to judge, actually showed no mercy. And that's one of the reasons later on in one of the prophets that it says that God was going to judge Babylon. Because he said, "I called you to do this, but you showed no mercy." Maybe we could say you went beyond what I wanted you to do. And so, in case you're wondering why I'm sharing this verse, Lamentations 5 and verse 12, it says elders were not respected. And yes, elders were particularly the people who should have been most respected in that society. But it does strike me that elders are not being respected here in this matter of assisted suicide if we think the best for them is to bump them off early, if you'll allow me to say that. Particularly if they are saying, in these countries where it's legal, that they fear being a burden. Nobody should fear being a burden. I hope that's not the true for any of you here, or any of you watching the recording. I hope it's not true that you fear being a burden for your families, because you have a right, if you are heading towards the end of your life, you have a right to expect to be supported by family and by others. But you know, where it says that elders were not respected, that was part of God's judgment. God allowed elders not to be respected. He allowed them to be hung up by their hands. Just like he allowed young people to fall by the sword. It was a judgment. I hope and pray that God is not planning to judge us by handing us over to assisted suicide. Certainly something we need to pray about. But I just share that verse because it did strike me, particularly with the context of it being the judgment of the Lord. Just one other verse to mention. Again, we're not going to particularly turn to it. It's just really one phrase in the verse. Isaiah 30 and verse 1. Where it talks about the Israelites adding sin to sin. Isaiah 30 and verse 1. And of course, I've always mentioned abortion. We could mention other things in our nation. If we legalise this as well, we will be adding sin to sin. And Jesus in the New Testament, criticising the current day culture and the religious leaders there, he said, "Fill up the measure of your guilt." And he went on to say, so that the sins of previous generations would be required of that generation. And again, if we legalise this at this time, the Lord could well combine a judgment for not just this, but all of the other bloodshed and other things that have happened in our nation. Obviously, it's serious, and I trust you share that feeling from this. But as we come to prayer, we should be encouraged, and that's why I said to keep in your mind that verse from the worship. Hope will rise as we wait upon the Lord. Because a Telegraph journalist, not that it matters who wrote, do try to look at sources from various different places. It is good not just to take news from one source. But a journalist said, there is a continuous, unrelenting global campaign on this subject. And as I thought about that, I thought, yes, that's true. But you know, Psalm 2 talks about the leaders gathering together against the Lord and taking counsel together. You could see a global push in Psalm 2, couldn't you? And yet he was going to laugh at them. And Elisha's servant, when he saw all of those chariots and horsemen, all of the people who had come from this foreign nation to attack and capture Elisha, he was shown the vision by Elisha's prayer of the forces, the heavenly forces around the city. You know, there is more with us than with them. That doesn't mean that we can assume that the Lord is going to defeat these plans, but it should give us hope that he might, and that he certainly can, as with any time we pray. So let's come to prayer about this matter. And if you are in any way needing a reminder, just a reminder of the three things we are considering, although we're going to take up the matter obviously generally, but specifically we have the British Medical Association vote this coming Tuesday, the 14th of September. We have Baroness Meach's private bill in the Lords debated in October. And then we have the Scottish bill from a private member, which will have a consultation expected in the autumn. Let's come in prayer. Let's seek the Lord as to how he will lead us. He might want us to take up the matter generally. He might want us to pray specifically about one of those things. Let's not assume. Let's seek his leading. We're going to have two prayer times actually. One on this, and then another possibly shorter, led by Josh, that may or may not follow on. But at least one of these times we'll consider